So welcome everybody to today's session, which is on audience travel. Our team today is myself and Anya May Hughes. We both work with Native Events as sustainability coordinators. And I suppose just a quick reminder of where we are in the autumn series training webinars. Today we'll discuss audience travel. And I suppose just a reminder that we will only focus on this segment of travel as an impact area. But next week, we will take, I suppose, the more broader topic of travel and transport. So I suppose if there's any information that you feel that you've missed from today that does, I suppose, form part of that bigger travel and transport impact area, we will, of course, be covering that in more detail in next week's webinar. Then following on from that, we will be providing a session on content, programming and communications. On the 5th of November, we have a session dedicated to festivals and production companies on energy, and that's specific to festivals and production companies. And then our final session for the group of strategically funded organisations and art centres will be on climate adaptation. So just a quick reminder of what's coming up. And this is the link again for all of the webinars and the recordings and the presentations and resources. So I suppose before we get started, we just kind of wanted to get your input on this topic of audience travel and maybe your experience of engaging with your audience travel. We've just launched a poll there. I suppose we appreciate that this is quite a difficult impact area to start to understand. I suppose a lot of this is about behavioural change, but we just listed 11 possible challenges and obstacles that organisations might face in addressing audience travel, and just to get a sense of what you feel might be the top 3 main challenges that you face. And that could be on how to reduce the dependence on single occupancy car travel. Accessibility of public transport to your venue might be a challenge. The reliability of public transport and the timetables. Is there an option for the audience to get home when your show finishes? If you wanted to provide private hire transport for your event, is cost a challenge? Is there a nervousness or a concern around encouraging public transport? Do we want to encourage our audience to take public transport, but there might be safety concerns or antisocial behaviour concerns? For encouraging people to cycle to our event, is there a lack of secure bicycle lockup? To encourage people to walk to our event, is there a lack of adequate public walkways? In terms of audience travel, I suppose it's is the barrier and the obstacle, is it how to monitor and measure the carbon emissions from audience travel? Or is it on how to engage and communicate with our audience? Something that comes up in a case study that we'll reference later on is there a stigmatization of using public transport? Like, does our audience want to use public transport? And then if you are an organization that, depends on an international audience, then of course that is another huge challenge and obstacle that we face. So it's just to get a sense there on what are the main challenges and obstacles you face. And just looking at that, I mean, we see a lot of responses there for single occupancy car travel, accessibility of public transport, the reliability of transport. And what's interesting there, a lot of you chose that nervousness or concern about encouraging public transport, where safety or antisocial behaviour could be an issue. And then, of course, monitoring and measuring carbon emissions and engaging and communicating with your audience. So we will certainly address a number of those issues, and some of our case studies will also, I suppose, reflect a lot of that feedback. So thank you very much for that. I think it's good to start to understand, who we have in the audience, and I'll just share the results as well. So thank you for that. It's I think coming up top there is the reliability of public transport, and a lot of this is within our control, a lot of this is outside of our control also. Okay. Apologies. Okay, there we go. Okay, we'll get rid of that. So if going back to the focus of today's session, it would be very much, I suppose, it's tackling audience travel, but acknowledging that there's many barriers and obstacles to reducing the impact of audience travel. We will focus on some case studies and some resources, and I suppose just to get into that practical mindset of, you know, how do we start, or if we have started, how do we continue making the improvements? But it's also, I suppose, hoping to hear from you. I know that many of you will be based in very different locations with many different challenges when it comes to audience travel. So we'd certainly like to hear from you, and also in terms of how you have approached audience travel and any actions you've already taken. And then, you know, if you've started in understanding and addressing audience travel, then, you know, what might be the next steps to take after this session. But essentially what we will cover, I suppose we will take a moment to understand the environmental impact of audience travel. We will discuss the scope of the issue, highlight some key impact areas from audience travel, take a look at the carbon emissions associated with the audience travel, the local and environmental impact that audience travel can have, and then the energy and resource consumption associated with audience travel. And as always, we'll include some suggested strategies on how to reduce the impact of audience travel. Again, looking at case studies, allowing time for discussion and you know, possibly some peer-to-peer sharing. But I will now hand over to my colleague, Anya May.
Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone is well this morning. Just to let you know, the chat function there was disabled, but it is now enabled. So do please, I encourage you to, I suppose, comment in the chat, and just if there's anything that comes up as we go along, we'd be happy to address it as we go along or at the end. There's also a Q&A function, which you're also welcome to use. So thank you, Noreen, so much for introducing the webinar today. I think as you mentioned, audience travel is a significantly challenging area. I think that what we need to recognize is that there is so much that is out of our control with our audience choices, but what we need to recognize is those opportunities that might be there where we can influence. So, you know, the industry investigations into the impact of audience travel, even as far back as 2007, have really consistently pointed to this being a hotspot area of impact. So, you know, carbon footprints are becoming more detailed as we begin to accurately measure more elements across scope 1, 2, and 3. But generally, you know, back in 2007, we still had a good understanding that, you know, audience travel accounted for around 43% of the total carbon emissions from the entire UK music industry. And that was a report that was done by Julie's Bicycle. So this travel does not include, as we mentioned, the artists, the crew, the volunteers, and any of those logistics in terms of transporting the materials and goods that you might need and the infrastructure for your event. Another study by Powerful Thinking in 2017 actually estimated that 80% of an event's carbon footprint comes from the travel and transport. So this is a really significant quantity of emissions for half of the overall carbon coming from audience travel within that travel and transport impact area. So we're talking about 40 to 50% of an event's footprint from audience travel. So it really is significant. It really is an important area to tackle. Audience travel goes beyond carbon, of course. So there's significant impacts in terms of the organizer from a cost perspective, from a space perspective, infrastructure, staffing, etc. And then with the audience, you have the likes of fuel costs, ticket costs, and the actual availability of transport. And we touched on that a little bit there with those challenges. It's really, really quite broad across the board as well. And I think something, you know, specific to Ireland as well that I think a lot of people will understand and resonate with is the reliability of public transport and the availability in those rural communities and slightly different locations that we tend to hold our events. And then again, going beyond this, we have the impact on the actual local community where the event is taking place, and also the biodiversity and the local habitats in that areas in relation to, you know, the disruption and the pollution, both air quality and noise that we see as a result, particularly with those events that have high single occupancy car travel involved in them. So Net Zero Carbon Events Initiative undertook a prioritization exercise, which is quite interesting, just from the event industry perspective, to really establish the kind of emission sources and where I suppose collaborative action should be focused. So I've included this because, again, it's just an important thing to recognize as event organizers, and I myself have experienced this when producing events, where we are at in terms of audience travel and the level of influence that we can have. So as you can see with the audience travel, it is quite small, so you may have to lean in a little bit here. But with the audience travel, the influence is low, the size is very high, and the significance is very high as well. So we do have to look at this and remember this as we move forward and we look at this impact area, where we can't control everything within this impact area, but what we really need to do is find ways and opportunities to engage as much as possible to increase that influence. Next slide. So how do people currently travel to events? And again, this is something that we all know too well, and we know ourselves from our own events. But generally, from what we see for Greenfield Festival sites, is that we have a huge amount of private car travel. So this is a report here on the right from Powerful Thinking in 2017. And you'll have to forgive me now, a lot of our statistics will be from the UK, because they have a huge amount of research in these areas. But it will be very similar for Ireland. So 61% of people are traveling by car to those Greenfield festivals in the UK, with only 4% by coach, 15% by train, and then 15% by lift share. So again, we can really see the significance of the single occupancy car travel. And this is down to reasons such as, people not wanting to carry as much stuff. They might have families, they may need to travel long distances to get to the event. So there are variance of factors that are influencing why people choose certain ways to get to events. And I suppose our role then is around the influencing part. And then with urban venues, what we tend to see is a dissimilar, I suppose, quantity in terms of train and public transport use. It's slightly higher, but again, we do often see a huge amount of single occupancy car travel. And then again, for those rural venues as well. So the challenges and barriers, as we've mentioned, and I would encourage, if anyone has any challenges and barriers that we haven't included in that first poll, if there's anything outside of that, please pop them into the chat. But yeah, it's very much there's a lack of infrastructure that is safe, affordable, reliable, and feasible a lot of the time for both the organizer and the attendee. But where we have opportunities here is to cut this very large impact of carbon and to make our audiences, I suppose, those agents of change and those influencers with us. And a lot of that will then come down to the communications that we have with them, the transparent, I suppose, messaging that we put out there about our events. Orla has just popped into the chat there around, the lack of good bicycle lanes as a barrier to alternative methods of travel. And I think that's a really, really important thing, particularly anybody who lives in urban areas. I myself am living in Dublin city centre, and there's often times when I've wanted to travel to an event where I've just felt that the bicycle lanes are not adequate and that I am, in fact, putting myself at risk by doing that later in the evening as well. So that's a really, really challenging one for sure. So just to kind of ground us a little bit in how, understanding how people move from A to B, I just really enjoy this graphic because it's really hard hitting home, I suppose. What does it take to move 1,000 people from A to B? So it can be one train with 8 carriages, it could be 15 buses, but it could be anywhere between 250 to 1,000 cars. And I think something that really hits home here with this graphic is that car piece, particularly in Ireland, where we are very car centric, is where we can influence in terms of getting the occupancy of cars up and getting people to lift share as much as possible where there may not be other options in place for people. And very briefly, I just wanted to show a quick video. In 2003, there was a US car company that were trying to actually advertise car sales by making it a more personal experience for people and talking about the human element of people in a car. And what they actually ended up doing was advocating on behalf of a car-free world, in my opinion, because it really just highlights the inefficiency of cars. So we're just going to have a look at that very quickly.
design our cars, we don't see sheet metal. We see the people who may one day drive them.
So I find that a very interesting video. Again, just to ground ourselves and see the inefficiency of cars and the amount of space that they take up in our world. So I will just move on to the, yeah. So yeah, again, like it's really important to understand that, you know, we're talking about events here and we're talking about space and we're talking about inefficiencies. But I think, you know, as organizers, we're also living in various different locations in Ireland, rural and urban, and we're all experiencing this on a daily basis as well. I myself am experiencing, for example, that bicycle lane issue, and other people are experiencing the lack of transport in more rural areas. So this is just a photo here. I wanted to include it again, just as a grounding and seeing the amount of space that cars are taking up. This is a small 5,000 capacity festival in Ireland, and the red circle there is indicating the actual festival site where all of the activity and all the fun and the reason everybody there is taking place. That's that location, and then the rest of it there is actually the car park. So there's a huge amount of infrastructure, there's a huge amount of staffing and time that's gone into actually facilitating car parks at festivals. And this is actually a festival that does a huge amount of work to get people to try and car share and to try and use public transport as well. And it is a challenge for them. And you still end up, because of those rural locations, having a lot of single occupancy car travel. So a huge amount of what you need to do around car travel is messaging. And there was a report from the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, and they just, again, I just wanted to highlight, they include this piece about the space used for car parking. And you can see here again at Leeds Festival, the significance of this, with more than 100,000 meters squared used for car parking. And this is an area that will have local habitats. This is an area that has a local community nearby. So how is this actually affecting everything else as well? And very quickly, I just wanted to touch on a more recent example, I suppose, which was All Together Now Festival in 2019. And I'm sure some of you will remember this example where, you know, traffic ground to a halt on the approach to the Curramore estate where the festival takes place, leaving the town of Carmarthenshire. And it really impacted the local community. You were talking about people who couldn't get to their homes, who couldn't collect their children from school. You were completely clogged. And then also for the attendees, hours and hours spent in the car, missing the first act of the festival. But again, you know, thinking about audience travel on a larger scale, on a smaller scale, whatever it may be, is an extremely important thing from an attendee experience point of view, but then also from a local impact and an emissions point of view, where this not only increased their emissions, but also actually infected that community directly because people were sitting for so long in their cars. And I just want to point to here on the right, I suppose, some of their messaging. So, you know, the messaging really mentioned at the time the country roads around the estate as being the problem, you know, and that they had actually encouraged people to use public transport and carpool. But it really highlights that need for, you know, the local engagement to understand the issues with access and understand how the local traffic would continue as normal on the festival day. And make sure that the local population can provide those invaluable insights into how that area works, and making sure that those lines of communications are open between the two. So, you know, we really need those robust communications highlighting those benefits of public transport, because in this instance, you know, just saying that you've kind of pointed to public transport being available or coaches being available maybe isn't enough. It needs to be right up there as the top thing. So this festival has definitely improved its traffic management in recent years. But, you know, it remains a very good example, I suppose, of the impact of audience on the local environment and the local community. So now that we've kind of looked at and grounded ourselves in the impact of audience travel, just want to kind of, you know, ask here, cultural organizations, should they be climate action influencers? So I'm just going to pop a quick poll here. Where are my polls gone? There they are. So I'm just going to launch this. No, that's fine. I've launched it there.
I was keen to go ahead there.
No. So yeah, do you agree that cultural organizations should be climate action influencers? You know, I think at COP28 we saw that, you know, the role of culture has very much been recognized in the climate movement as an important influencer in moving people towards climate action. So I wondered if you agree with this. I'll give it a few seconds there. We have nearly everybody responded yes. And I'd love to hear from people as well, just, you know, why they think they should or shouldn't be a climate change, climate action, sorry, I should say, influencer. Cultural organizations event, maybe if there's anything around your event specifically, I'd be really interested to hear as well. So Marie Louise plainly has raised a hand. Louise, I might just ask in the chat if you would like to speak aloud, and just bearing in mind that this webinar is recorded. Okay, Maria, I've asked you to unmute, so you're welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much. No, what I meant to do actually was submit rather than raise my hand. Sorry about that.
That's no worries. Do you have anything you'd like to add around why you think cultural organizations should be climate action influencers?
Well, I think cultural organizations are leaders in the field anyway, and we tend to be innovative thinkers. So I think it's important to lead the way. You know, and also as creatives as well, there's lots of different ways we can approach it. So yes, I do agree.
Okay, thank you so much. Perfect. Okay. Well, we've had one person disagree, and I'll allow that person to jump into the chat and include that if they like to, or if not, that's absolutely no problem. So I'm just going to end that poll now. 95% of people do agree that cultural organizations should be climate action influencers. I suppose there's been a comment in the chat that it should not rest on artists, and that artists maybe shouldn't be responsible for being climate action influencers. And I completely understand where you're coming from there. I think that there is sometimes a pressure for artists to focus their work on current topics and political issues. And I think that sometimes art is not necessarily always grounded in that space. So I think I completely understand where you're coming from in that position. Thank you for sharing that. So I suppose we'll move onwards then towards the strategies for reducing audience travel. So, you know, the core principles very much are always to, how I would see it is to prioritize and to communicate the most sustainable option first. And I completely understand where that can be challenging. Again, going back to the obstacles and the barriers that we've talked about around the nervousness about encouraging certain things based on what might be available in your area. And I think it's important for everybody here to understand that you know your event better than everybody else, and this will be different for everybody else. And I think as part of a strategy in reducing audience travel, we need to understand our own situations better and what way people are currently traveling to them. But the core principles really for any policy on audience travel needs to be around, you know, walking and cycling where possible, understanding if as we mentioned, if there's sufficient bike lockup, if there's pathways for pedestrians that are safe and accessible to your venue, and engaging the local council where you can when you have these issues to highlight, you know, I'm running an event at my venue for the last X amount of years and we don't have sufficient bike lockup. And I believe this might be a barrier as to why people are not traveling in this method. So that's a really important part of this. And then public transport use, again, would be the second best option. Meeting with local authorities, understanding whether or not they have timetables that actually work with your event and your festival, and trying to, I suppose, in some ways get information from them around the increase of travel of audiences around the times of your events. This can be a very challenging exercise to do. I've definitely been there myself, where I'm trying to get data from local authorities, and you really do have to work hard to communicate with them and just keep on top of that messaging and trying to get information from them. But it can be really beneficial in understanding, I suppose, how many people are actually traveling by public transport, and then, you know, hopefully messaging and influencing people that way to continue encouraging it. And then when it comes to the car situation at events, which there is a huge amount of at Irish festivals and events, you know, it's talking to your audience, maybe limiting car parking space, putting in car parking charges. I know I've seen at some events previously where they actually increase the car parking charges based on the amount of people that are in, or the less people that are in the car. So for example, if you have a car with a higher occupancy rate, you might charge 10 euros, but if you have a car that is a single occupancy rate, it might be 20 euros. And it's just to discourage. Now, again, you need to understand your demographic and how that charge might sit, but it's an interesting way to look at it. And I think, again, given that there's so much that's out of our control when it comes to audience travel, we need to get creative with the solutions and how we actually go about influencing people. And really, so much of that is through the communications between you as an event organizer and your audience. I'll give an example of an event that recently happened in Dublin, a very large event, which I'm sure everyone is aware of. Coldplay came to town in Dublin city centre at Croke Park. And something that was very interesting around their policy on communications is that no matter what promoter they're working with, they are in all of their communications communicating at the top the most sustainable way to travel to the event. So when you go into the website, when you go onto the email marketing, on their social media, they're never putting information about car parking at the top. And this is something that we actually see a lot. And again, understandably, where we are in a situation where people are traveling by car for the most part, you want to make that information readily available to them. But to kind of piece that information together to make sure that you have it almost as a hierarchy with, here is how you walk and cycle, here is how you get public transport, and then at the bottom you have the car information, just so it's tiered so that people are seeing the options for walking and cycling first, public transport, and then car travel. And something again that's really interesting there, I suppose, about the Coldplay tour is that they had a temporary kind of bike lockup put in specifically for the event. They worked with the local council and they communicated that not on the promoter's website, but actually on the social media of the band. So again, this is a really key piece. It's travel and transport for your audiences really needs to be front and center in your communications. It needs to be on the social media page. It needs to be readily available for people in advance of the event and on the day of the event as a reminder, because people are often very last minute deciding if they're going to event and how they're going to get there. So looking at measuring and monitoring audience travel is challenging, but it's very beneficial, again, to kind of piece that with your messaging and your communications and building out that strategy, because the more of an understanding you have of how your audience travels to the event, the better then you can plan around those communications and putting in any supplementary transport plans in place. So again, speaking with the local providers, as I mentioned, to see if they can give you that information around data and the increase of travel to your event is a really great place to start. It also helps to build a connection. It shows that you're interested in getting people on public transport, and really just having that relationship with them can be very beneficial. And then surveying your audiences. A lot of events and festivals already do a survey, a post-event survey from your audience on how they traveled to the event, aiming to get roughly a 10% sample size of your audience. And then you can scale that up when you want to actually go and do a calculation based on the information that you've gotten. And you can do that through the Julie's Bicycle Creative Green Tools, where you can kind of put in those percentages of your audience and how they traveled there to calculate a carbon footprint. And again, with audience travel, you have to be cognizant of the fact that it is very hard to get this information. So it is better to have an estimate than nothing at all in this impact area, so that you can have a more complete carbon footprint. Including monitoring, measuring as well, just as part of your traffic and your, I suppose, car park staff's roles is a really key thing. You can monitor the occupancy levels of cars, so you can get a good understanding of the average and whether or not people are traveling there in a single occupancy car, but then also just getting that quantity of cars that is coming to your event. So again, you can include that in your reporting and your carbon footprints in futures going forward. So I just wanted to get a quick sense check of what actions, I suppose, if any, anyone on this webinar has taken in relation to audience travel so far. So I would love if people could just pop those into the chat to see if there's anything that we haven't covered here that you are doing. I know that some people might be more advanced in terms of addressing audience travel, and we are doing, I suppose, a baseline webinar today looking at the case studies and the strategies that other people have undertaken. So I'll just let you guys, I suppose, pop into the chat there anything that you have done with audience travel so far that you'd like to share just in the chat, and then I'll hand over to Noreen, who is now going to give some more detailed, I suppose, case studies of strategies that other events and festivals have undertaken.
Thanks very much, Anya. So as year commenting and thinking about that, we're just going to look at two case studies. So two very different approaches to tackling audience travel. And I suppose this is a very kind of top-down approach with Massive Attack and how they address their audience travel associated with their Act 1.5 concert that was held this year. We'll look at that and I suppose their engagement with the Tyndall Centre for Climate Research. And from that, a report was produced on a roadmap for reducing emissions at large events. And I suppose Anya mentioned the Coldplay example. And this example, Massive Attack, it just, I suppose, is another good example of what large bands with huge resources can achieve and what impacts they can make. But really, Massive Attack started addressing emissions from their touring back in 2019. They completed their European tour only by train. They then started working, or they, I suppose, commissioned the Tyndall Centre for Climate Research to publish a roadmap for a low carbon future for live music. That was in 2021. And then this year they held their concert Act 1.5, and that was in their hometown of Bristol. And I suppose they were attempting to have the lowest carbon emissions show of its scale ever staged, and to do, I suppose, to do as much as they could to reduce emissions, seeking to power the concert with 100% renewable energy. They did a lot with the event and the venue and the energy, but I suppose they also did a lot with audience travel. And there's a short video from the Tyndall Centre for Climate Research in specifically what they did and the impact areas. So I'll just show a little bit of this just as an introduction to how they approached working with Massive Attack.
Having reached the outer limits of what we could achieve on our tours, including banned travel by train and drastically reducing any aviation, we commissioned a universal roadmap to try and make a wider contribution to the decarbonisation of live music. We decided to work with the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, a specialist body that brings together scientists, engineers, economists, and social scientists to accelerate society's transition to a sustainable low-carbon future and avert climate catastrophe.
So to start our work on the roadmap, we looked first at Massive Attack's own tour plans, and we ran various scenarios to look at how we could get emissions down within those plans. But then we wanted to look more at how we could create a roadmap for the sector. And it was really important to us that we built on the best practice and the analysis that's already there, the literature that's already there talking about how to do this or demonstrating how elements of it have been done. But then we also wanted to test that and to find out what people across the sector were doing. So we did a series of interviews with agents, with promoters, with ticket providers, that kind of thing. And then once we had a draft of the roadmap, we took that to stakeholders for feedback so that we could iterate and build on the advice and experience that they have.
We've now published the roadmap and shared it as an open resource with our industry.
In the roadmap, we look at three areas. So we look at travel, so that's about moving people and equipment, venues, so that's about energy consumption there, and audience travel. So if we think about key findings across those three areas, for the travel part, that is about trying to reduce the need for travel in the first place. So right from the inception of a tour, thinking about the design of that show so that it is as low carbon as possible. Now that means routing it as efficiently as possible, but also moving as little stuff and as few people around as you can. It's also then about trying to shift the mode of that. So planning so that you can take the train if that is an option rather than flying, and certainly arranging it so that you don't rely upon private jets to get between venues and sort of at the end say, well, there was nothing we could do but that. It's about building it in right from the beginning to say all these low carbon things can be done because we planned for it. On venues, it's about adopting energy efficiency, so whether that's in the equipment or the building itself, and also looking at things like plug and play opportunities, but then also looking at how that energy is provided, so on-site generation or really high quality renewable energy tariffs. And then in the third part, the audience travel, it's about making sure that active travel and public transport are the best and easiest ways to get to a show, and that they're the most fun, and that we look in time once that is all sorted out, and that is the case, that those are the best options, that we disincentivise the private car option for going to gigs.
So you can see there, I suppose, in terms of their audience travel approach, I suppose more specifically in terms of the initiatives and incentives that they put in place, it really was, I suppose, they tried to deter long distance travel. And of course, they had control over this, so, this was a situation where they were fully in control, or almost fully in control of what they could do. But they really, I suppose, offered incentives for, I suppose, local travel. They offered initial pre-sale of tickets for local postal codes only. They encouraged audiences to travel by public transport. They partnered with the UK booking platform Trainhugger, which contributes a quarter of its revenue to restoring the British countryside. They really incentivized people to travel by train. So they gave train travellers special privileges, access to a VIP bar with separate toilets, extra pre-sale tickets, and free transfers to and from the train station via electric bus. They also worked with the local train network, Great Western Railway, to lay on 5 extra trains for travelling fans. So this is an example of a very large event, and the power that they had in terms of being able to partner with trains, and have those extra trains. So it's a very, I suppose, top-down approach. But what came out of the Super Low Carbon Live Music report, I suppose, further recommendations for town and city venues. I suppose recommending to collaborate with local authority and transport providers, looking at increasing the provision of public transport when the show is finished. So acknowledging that, kind of going back to what we said at the start, that there's not always that option, in timetabling to get home when a show is finished. Kind of coming back to very similar, I suppose, recommendations that we've mentioned already in terms of improving a secure bicycle storage at venues, offering incentives for the audience to travel with public transport. And then for festivals, their recommendations that came out were really looking at, I suppose, encouraging public transport, again, providing the bicycle storage, more frequent bus or coach connection to transport hubs, and incentivizing car sharing, where there were, I suppose, good low carbon options in place, where already they were starting from a good place. It was really about disincentivizing private car use, and really looking at that in terms of improving on the sustainable audience travel. And then, I suppose, not actively promoting flying for live music events. So we can see kind of the same recommendations coming up. And I suppose to bear in mind that this is very much a top-down approach. But I suppose another case study, which is a bottom-up approach. This case study is of a year-long project in Scotland, and that was led by Perth Theatre and Concert Hall, collaborating with Creative Carbon Scotland and the artist Helen McCrory. So I suppose the initiative recognised that audience travel constituted one of the largest sources of emissions for Perth Theatre and Concert Hall and institutions like that. And I suppose they were, acknowledging that, they didn't have direct control over the audience travel choices, but how would they encourage more sustainable options, by, I suppose, fostering community engagement with their audience. And, this is the pilot project that was developed. So it used creative methods to encourage audience members travelling to and from the theatre and concert hall to use more sustainable methods. It wanted to gain a better understanding of the barriers that currently exist for people in using more sustainable travel, and then identify potential solutions to address these barriers. So I suppose over the course of a year, they had a series of workshops. And this was really providing a platform for their audience members to share their experiences, in terms of how do they get to the theatre and concert hall, workshops where they would explore the benefits of sustainable travel, and then uncover and discuss the barriers to choosing more sustainable travel options. So then with the outcomes from the workshops, they were able to have discussions with the audience, with the staff, with local decision makers, and that led to a publicity campaign to raise awareness on more sustainable travel. So there was great insights that came out of that pilot project, and that they were able then to share those to inform similar initiatives across Scotland, and really, I suppose, to use this as a pilot project. There was a lot of learnings from it. So there was a lot of different workshops held throughout the year. There was a really creative approach in terms of engaging with different audiences, in keeping their audiences engaged. Just that image on the right on the top. So the artist ran a session at a local climate cafe about sustainable travel into Perth, and people were able to share their thoughts on barriers to and opportunities for sustainable travel. And then they were invited to design their dream bus ticket. And then to get people to that climate cafe, they used a local community minibus. So people from nearby villages were brought to the climate cafe for that workshop. And then the second image below, that was an event that they had at the concert hall called Ticket to Ride. But they had a performance by an orchestra. They had an exhibition of creative work that was produced by people at the climate cafes. They had a panel discussion. So they held this event around, again, the findings of the workshop and bringing together all the different audiences. So it was just, I suppose, the difference in all the workshops that they had, and here are 3 more examples of workshops. And bear in mind, this was held throughout a 12-month period, and the approaches were very, very different, and that creative approach to discussing the issues and highlighting barriers and then providing solutions. But the image on the left, that was a workshop for families at Perth Theatre. It included circle games, songs, monoprinting, and a giant collaborative drawing. And, you know, they found that the children had huge enthusiasm for forms of transport other than cars. And, you know, they talked a lot about how these ways of getting around were more exciting and sociable. And just that insight from children. The middle image there, this is an image of one of the climate cafes. So they ran a number of climate cafes in the surrounding towns in Perth, or the surrounding towns to Perth. And the artist convened discussions on sustainable travel, and they just got people to share their ideas through creative methods. And then they brought all of that together. They took all of the findings and the work that people had done from the cafes. They brought all of that to Perth Concert Hall and had an event. And then visitors were also encouraged to leave their thoughts and to add dots to a map showing how they had come to Perth Theatre. So a real plotting of how they were travelling and just, I suppose, all that contribution and bringing that all together in a creative way. And then the image on the right with the 2 ladies on the bus, passengers on the number 8 bus from Oakbank into Perth city centre. They, on a day in October, they were treated to a pop-up performance in the form of a flash mob by Craigie Community Choir. So I suppose that was just really, it was another way of highlighting the benefits of sustainable travel. But the artist also created a film documenting all of the workshops and bringing all of that together. And they had a showing of that as well at the end of the pilot project period. So just such, I suppose, creative examples really of how to engage with your audience. And what came out of that process, the barriers that were highlighted, and we've, you know, kind of gone through some of these already, and we're hearing that these are also similar to our own barriers, was that public transport was too infrequent or unreliable. Public transport times were a barrier. The times didn't match up, you know, so you couldn't use public transport in the evenings, you couldn't get home from events. None or not enough access to services. So, you know, people in the villages or in the rural areas, there just weren't any bus stops in their area, or they were too far away. Slower travel times when traveling with public transport, so having to get various connecting buses, and just where it was easier to say, we'll just jump in the car. The cost was also a barrier. So that kind of was an incentive to use the car as well. And then accessibility, there were mobility limitations. And, you know, I suppose it's understanding the audience. You know, many of their audience felt that there were accessibility issues with using the bus. And then safety was a barrier. You know, it was just, I suppose, again, coming home maybe later in the evenings, there were safety issues. And then a barrier that also came up from the consultation process was stigmatization. There was a social stigma to using public transport or the bus, and it was considered a poor person's form of travelling. But I suppose some of the recommendations that came out of the process, and a lot of these are top down, some are bottom up, but these were some of the recommendations. It was, work with community transport groups to pilot a theatre bus, develop a system to enable car sharing, link travel guidance with ticket sales, trial different end times for selected shows. So actually kind of look at it the other way and say, well, maybe we should look at our show times to fit in with the public transport timetable. This is a very top-down approach, work on laying the groundwork for publicly owned bus services, work with partners like Perth Theatre and Concert Hall to improve access to information on public transport, campaign to counter negative stories around public transport and tackle stigma, and then offer active support and promotion for community transport groups. So then, I suppose the results from the pilot project definitely resulted in improved knowledge and understanding. It had created a space for conversation. It had helped develop plans to address issues around sustainable travel, produced new creative work and legacy resources. And of course, that was shared among institutions and in Scotland, and it did become, a successful pilot project. It empowered and platformed individuals and communities. It encouraged positivity and enjoyment and generated interest and brought in people. So I suppose when we reflect on that pilot project and, looking again at, I suppose, expanding, some of the strategies for reducing audience travel, I suppose we'd like to look at how we commit to doing this and, putting in place the structures, the resources, policies and responsibilities necessary to support and action your initiatives. We think understanding is very important in terms of understanding our impacts and establishing systems to measure and monitor them continually. And I suppose always improving, implementing our action plan to reduce environmental impact, but, always having, I suppose, to build on that annually and always try to seek improvements. And then communication is extremely important. And we've kind of seen that throughout the discussion so far, in terms of involving your team, your suppliers, your audiences, and sharing and exchanging knowledge with others. But I think we might stop talking now. Or at least I'll stop talking. I'll also stop sharing. But before I do, I'll just pose the question. If you share some of the barriers from the Creative Carbon Scotland case study, or what recommendations can you apply? But I suppose it would be interesting to hear from you. I suppose, were a lot of the barriers relevant? Did you recognise a lot of those barriers? How close to that experience are we as organisations today? And, could we think that any of those recommendations would apply to us as well?
We
so
might-
I'll stop you. Yeah.
We might just start by putting those in the chat,
Yes.
and then we will
Yeah.
probably stop recording to then have a discussion if anyone would like to join the conversation. But I just wanted to highlight as well, we talked a lot about influence in the audience, but from that very, very large pilot study, which I recognise is a very, very large pilot study, which would have taken a huge amount of resources to get off the ground. What they've done is they've created a lot of information and knowledge that they can then leverage and use to not only influence their audiences, but more so influence the local authorities and the public services that are available in their areas. And I think as people that interact with public services every day, but then also as arts and cultural organisations, we have not only a responsibility, but we also have a opportunity to influence and to connect with and to speak to those local authorities and to highlight the issues that we're facing. I know that there's other things happening, I suppose, specifically in Ireland and in Dublin around Give Us the Night, which is more so to do with the nighttime economy. And a lot of that is, I suppose, a lot of the people involved in that are more so relating to clubs and venues that are very, very late night, but they are experiencing the same issues as people who are finishing their shows just after the bus timetables run out. So it's about connecting with all of these people and coming together and sharing all of those barriers and being able to influence a lot of those local authorities as well. So we have a few things in the chat here that we'll have a look at. So one positive thing we can say in Ireland is that public transport has become really affordable. It's just a pity it's not so far reaching, and still all roads lead to Dublin. I think that is 100%. Yeah, I completely agree there. We very much have, I've noticed it recently as well, that the transport services have become a lot more affordable from a public transport perspective, but that similarly to a lot of other policies outside of transport, it is very Dublin centric. Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone else have any other comments from the recommendations from Creative Carbon Scotland or anything they'd like to share? I'm going to go up through the chat a little bit here. You know, mentioning that people are in large towns with good public transport from Dublin, but the audience within the county, you know, they still don't have a huge amount of public transport available to them. So then they are using the car, of course, to travel to the event. We're seeing that bicycle lanes are not great in Sligo, and for example, you know, you can travel part of it on the bicycle lane and then it disappears for a few kilometers. And something that I'd like to highlight here really is that you're obviously acknowledging this within this webinar and writing into the chat, and just to remember to actually write that into your policies and your implementation plan, like acknowledge the barriers that you are experiencing and the actions that you are doing in order to tackle them, because you are probably doing something. I'm sure you're communicating to your audience about this. So it's very important to acknowledge those barriers when you're actually writing those implementation plans as well, why it is that you are doing certain things and why it is that you are not, why it is that certain things are within your control and certain things are not. So other people, I suppose, are experiencing that they're in a city centre venue and that they are encouraging public transport, but again, the reliability for, I suppose, public transport post-show end time can be quite difficult. And again, with that Creative Carbon Scotland example, we're seeing that, you know, there needs to be creativity, there needs to be a little bit of flexibility in how we actually go around solving this impact area and trying to work with what we have going on, potentially looking at changing our times of our shows, which is a really big deal as well, you know. So it's kind of getting a good map of what your situation is and what you can actually trial and test. And unfortunately, a lot of it is trial and testing until you can figure out how to reduce those areas. Public transport within Donegal is virtually non-existent. Bicycle lanes are non-existent in the countryside. And, you know, I suppose there are other people who are experiencing that in Donegal. There are people who are experiencing it in their day-to-day lives. And then there's maybe also other arts and cultural venues. Like if you do a survey, can you come together and collaborate with other arts and cultural venues or community groups who are experiencing the same thing, so that, again, you can leverage that information when you are speaking to local authorities, local councillors, etc. What else do we have here? Yes, so again, like, look, and you know, I think what I find really interesting here is that we do have events that take place in isolated areas. We do have events that take place in rural areas, and we can't be the fun police or the crack police, as we might say, and say that, oh, well, you know, the greenest event is to not have an event at all, and that we shouldn't be putting them in these rural locations. Events and festivals, cultural organizations bring a huge amount to people's lives and are extremely important. And we need to understand that and remember that when, I suppose, that argument is made as well. Noreen, do you have anything you'd like to add? And I suppose what I'll do is I'll stop recording now and see if anybody would like to join the conversation or to say anything, I suppose, at the end of this.
I think I just wanted to respond to Una's question on how much the reference. Thank you. So just a quick look at the resources. We will include all of these in the recordings and the presentation. We have referenced a number of reports and webinars, videos from Julie's Bicycle. So we'll include those, and then just a list of additional resources that we will provide following on from this webinar also. And then just a quick reminder, next week we'll be looking at travel and transport. So looking forward to seeing you all next week as well. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a lovely day ahead.